year is 1993. America has its first black president. All the cool kids have pagers and Jenkos and are pretending that they understand how to play the game Myst. Go f*** a shit, you submarine maze! And the movie Groundhog Day, a story about a guy who is doomed to repeat the same tragic fate until he finally learns his lesson, has become a hit. And a man from Delaware stands on the Senate floor and flaps his gums.
We must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter or not whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street.
This is, of course, our current president, Joe Bobby, pushing for the passage of the infamous and controversial crime bill, a piece of legislation that he largely wrote himself, with a little help from the police, of course, that ultimately passed into law in 1994. While the bill did include some arguably good things like the Violence Against Women Act and an assault weapons ban, the law also did some, let's say, opposite of good things, whatever that word is. Joe himself unabashedly bragged about it in the aftermath of the law's passing as proof that the left wasn't soft on crime, saying this at the time.
Well, let me define the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is now for 60 new death penalties. That's what's in this bill. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party has 70 enhanced penalties, which my friend from California, Senator Feinstein, outlined every one of them. I gave her a list today. She asked what were in there to be sure. Every one of them. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 100,000 cops. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party is for 125,000 new state prison cells. The liberal wing of the Democratic Party ain't the old wing I knew.
Awesome stuff, Joe. Hey, fun philosophical exercise. If you take the Liberal Party and replace all of their values with a pro-cop and pro-prison agenda, do you suppose that's still a liberal party? Is it a party of Theseus thing? Or are you just perhaps making up words? I could certainly take a dump in my fish tank and call it the new toilet, but that doesn't exactly make it a common fact, does it? The absolutely terrible bill also ended higher education grants for inmates and provided incentives to states to adopt harsher mandatory minimum sentences, which accelerated the already growing mass incarceration crisis that began under the policies of Nixon and Reagan. And while crime bill apologists will point out that the law only pertained to federal policies and therefore had limited impact on incarceration rates, the fact is that this law and the alarmism around it became a model for tough on crime policies that were adopted by state governments throughout the country. For example, there's the California Three Strikes Law, which imposed a life sentence for almost any crime, no matter how minor, if the defendant had 2 prior convictions for crimes defined as serious or violent by the California Penal Code. And so by that definition, if I, in the 90s, broke into Hulk Hogan's house twice to steal his bandanas, that would be 2 instances of first-degree burglary and count as 2 strikes. Then, if 10 years later, I was caught shoplifting a copy of No Holds Barred, I could go to jail for life. I'm not saying it's good or right to deprive the Hulkster of his valuable skullet coverings or movie residuals, but just pointing out that this doesn't exactly feel like a life in jail offense. Maybe cute references to baseball, a game where people who strike out continue playing that game, are actually not cute when talking about a human life. So why? Why did we do this? Well, ever since the 1960s, America had seen a steady rise in crime, a fact that was, of course, exploited by bad faith political actors who pushed draconian policies that did little to solve the problem, often exacerbating it, and sensationalized media narratives about crime designed to scare the fuck out of white people for ratings continued throughout the 1990s, even when crime was starting to decline, which is why the first black First Lady of the United States was compelled to say this.
We need to take these people on. They are often connected to big drug cartels. They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called superpredators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
Mind you, this superpredator narrative was not just something concocted by the twisted mind of HR to the C. The term was coined by a young Princeton professor named John J. DiLulio, who used a single study of boys in Philadelphia to conclude that there would be an additional 30,000 young murderers, rapists, and muggers by the year 2000. And of course, the media instantly adopted this narrative and milked it like a sodden fear tit, a spooky boob, a shudder udder, a memory. But surprise, these predictions did not come to fruition. In fact, the violent crime rate continued to fall. A generation of remorseless young monsters did not surge together and create a Voltron of crime. But what did increase was the juvenile justice population as a result of the policies implemented in response to this manufactured hysteria, which is a nice way of saying, we decided to put a bunch of kids in cages. Something America loves to do, apparently. It's like our third most popular national sport now. And cases like this are why fear of crime politics is so dangerous. Because like I said, when people are scared, they are more likely to do dumb things. And in the early 1990s, the Democratic Party was really scared. It had lost 5 out of the last 6 presidential elections, and for decades had been labeled a party that was soft on crime. And since it's America we're talking about here, of course that label was created with a hearty dollop of racism.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton, who murdered a boy in a robbery, stabbing him 19 times. Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend. Weekend prison passes. Dukakis on crime.
Yeah, really scoop on that racism. Just slop it on there like a fistful of cream cheese, you honky freaks. This is a pretty infamous ad run during the 1988 presidential election between Republican candidate George H.W. Bush and Democratic candidate Michael Dukakis. During the summer before the election, Poppy Bush had latched onto the Willie Horton issue and made it a mainstay of his campaign speeches, releasing an ad attacking the Massachusetts furlough program, showing a series of prisoners walking through a revolving door. Soon after, the Willie Horton spot began running on television, and though this ad was ostensibly run by an independent group and was quickly pulled from circulation, television newscasts were more than happy to keep it on every screen in America. But whether or not the group that ran the ad, the National Security Political Action Committee, was in fact independent, or indeed working in concert with the Bush campaign as many suspected, their goal was the same. As Bush's campaign strategist Lee Atwater noted, by the time we're finished, they're going to wonder whether Willie Horton is Dukakis' running mate. And while that's just a dick nest of horror in itself, what doesn't get talked about much is the fact that the use of furloughs for prisoners was not only widespread across the nation at the time, but also a largely successful program. It wasn't bad, boosted prisoner morale, and rarely resulted in problems. But one of the tried and true rules of American political history is to never let facts or the truth get in the way of the political advantages that can be gained by leveraging racism. And an additional advantage that the GOP had going for them was that this was also a peak era of colorblindness. Wait, Willie Horton was a black man, you say? Why, I hadn't even noticed. Everyone looks like the same gray square to me. And it certainly didn't help that when confronted with the accusation of being soft on crime at a presidential debate by one of the moderators invoking the theoretical rape and murder of his wife, Dukakis responded with as much emotion as a calculator dressed up in a beige suit.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent, and I think there are better and more effective ways to deal with violent crime. We've done so in my own state. And
a few things. Weird and wildly inappropriate question, my God. But also, Come on, man, you're a politician. Be like, how dare you ask that question, you disgusting media, you. Fake news, may you shit sand. I'm not saying Dukakis should have said exactly that. The shitting sand thing might be a bit odd, but at least show some version of a human-adjacent emotion for the sake of gosh. And yet, on the substance, this goober was absolutely right about the death penalty. That there is no evidence that it deters violent crime. And as an addendum, the death penalty also costs a ton of money, habitually executes a whole bunch of innocent people, and also happens to be just cruel and wrong. I don't have a graphic for that last claim. It just is cruel and wrong. Like, if you believe that killing people is generally bad, with the exception of maybe self-preservation or puppet homicide, well then I'm not sure why you'd think that having our government systematically kill people they've already caught and jailed isn't also bad. But whether Dukakis lost the election because he was King Dweeb, or because America just wasn't ready for his luxurious eyebrows, is hard to say. Maybe it's both. But one thing we do know is that the lesson taken from this election was that the Democrats lost, yet again, for being soft on crime. Which is why you had the tough on crime pivot within the Democratic Party reach critical mass in the 1990s. But the 1988 election was really just the straw that broke the bushy-eyebrowed camel's back. Do camels have eyebrows? I'm not looking it up. They do now! But right-wing reactionaries had been meticulously melding the modern notions of race and crime for decades. As historian Joshua Zeitz has noted, in the 1970s and 1980s, Republican candidates successfully used violent crime as an issue to attract white voters. Fused with concerns over the economy, busing, and neighborhood integration, law and order politics dislodged millions of working and middle-class white voters from their former home in the Democratic Party. But of course, this is just the tip hot of the iceberg cold when it comes to the tremendous pants poop America took over this fear of crime. Hey, thanks for watching that clip. Here's the evergreen end plate to ask you to like and subscribe. It's any day of the year where you are.